Joining us now, and I should tell everybody, by the way, just while we're live, and we'll be back on format after the interview, but you can definitely hit us up with a super chat donation, and as with everything else, that's great when you do it. Just click super chat, and that's great. What am I in Rubin mode? Exactly. Joining us now is Crew on TMBS. We do a lot of illicit histories together on the history of the military-industrial complex, the bureaucracy and ideology, and he is the Pyle Professor of American Foreign Policy at the University of Washington. Of course, I'm talking about our friend Daniel Bessner. Danny, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
So I want to talk first about Samantha Power. Who is she, and why is she a problem?
Well, it's a leading question. So Samantha Power is someone who first came to public attention in the early 2000s. She wrote a book released in 2002 called A Problem from Hell. I believe the subtitle is America in the Age of Genocide.
Mm-hmm.
And the book essentially argued that the United States made a series of foreign policy failures over the course of the 20th century, beginning with the Armenian genocide and continuing through Saddam Hussein's gassing of Kurds in the late 1980s. Specifically, she said that U.S. policymakers made a mistake by not responding forcefully to genocide. And this was her big claim. It won the Pulitzer Prize in 2003. And she essentially argued that going forward, the United States needed to do a lot more to combat genocide. What I think it's important to emphasize is that Power has been caricatured as arguing in favor solely of military intervention. But in actuality, she essentially had a series of graduated steps that U.S. policymakers should take to respond to genocide. And she expresses in her book, A Problem from Hell, which won the Pulitzer. And what it essentially does, what this book essentially does, is that it crystallizes the 1990s era thinking about what the United States should do with its overwhelming military power in the wake of the Soviet Union's collapse. And listeners might know about genocides in Rwanda, genocides in the Balkans, and culminating with Kosovo. And the United States didn't intervene in Rwanda, but did eventually intervene in Bosnia. And this was basically the major foreign policy discussion amongst liberals after the Cold War, is how does the United States make the world a better place with its awesome power, political power, economic power, and of course, military power. And she writes this book. She becomes very famous. She begins working for Barack Obama. She leaves after working for Obama for a year, but Obama hires her as a foreign policy advisor on his campaign. And when he wins office in 2008, he names Power to two positions on the National Security Council. She serves on these positions during his first term, and then in his second term, she's the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. And just, I'll wrap up here, but very briefly, she was very much in favor of intervening in Libya to stop a massacre at Benghazi, or at what she perceived to be a massacre of Benghazi, and was also in favor of intervening militarily in Syria to combat Bashar al-Assad's use of chemical weapons. And that's Samantha Power in a nutshell.
So one track of criticizing her, and I think, did we already show this photo, guys, that we have up? One track of criticizing her. This is a photo of her during the Obama administration, taken with Henry Kissinger at a Yankees game. Yeah. And of course, even in her own book, which I actually read back in college myself, you know, if you write a modern history of the U.S. basic lack of response or complicity in genocide, obviously Henry Kissinger is going to come up. And if you have any kind of basic awareness of humanity, you would consider him a war criminal who's responsible for atrocities across the globe, obviously most famously in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, but, you know, Chile, Cyprus, you know, and so on. This is you know, and so one part of it is, okay, here's just the sort of trajectory of how somebody becomes a foreign policy mandarin, and maybe in the time that someone like Samantha Power is rising, you know, the discourse of so-called kind of like muscular liberalism or humanitarian intervention. There was all these sort of horrific terminology that was popular late in the Clinton administration, and then actually through you know, people in the Democratic Party and in the liberal intelligentsia who embraced the invasion of Iraq, people who put Tony Blair, who he did in the cold open, on a huge pedestal. That, you know, and so that it's all just sort of empty and bullshit, right? Like, how can somebody kind of discourse these types of concerns and then buddy with Kissinger. And that's fine. And you can tee off on that. And there's certainly truth in it. But I think what you're talking about is that there's actually a real, just as there was obviously fundamental problems in Kissinger's worldview, there's fundamental problems in the humanitarian intervention worldview, even if we took it at face value.
Right, and I think that's a good tee off, and I think it's important to say that in her book, Power actually basically criticizes Kissinger for being a war criminal. So I think this is sort of the ironies of the paths that one takes to get into actual power, and we could talk about that later. But what I think it's important to emphasize is that why Power is so interesting as a person is she basically embodies 2 decades of liberal thought about what to do when the United States no longer faces an existential enemy. So throughout the Cold War, there's this very clear logic. The United States needs to defeat communism, and that this is a political struggle, and the U.S. military is acting in a political way, and it's very much a part of this political ideology. But what happens after the collapse of the Soviet Union is you essentially have a generation of liberal thinkers, really a generation of Generation Xers, actually, people who are around 20, 25 when the Soviet Union collapses, the people who will literally staff the Obama administration later on. You have a generation of people who begin arguing that the American military, because it no longer faces a political ideology, and that there is the quote-unquote the end of history, and that everyone has agreed that liberal democratic capitalism, defined in a very ideological way, but that was not the language of the time. But the idea was that because everyone agreed on this particular political form, one was able to actually use the U.S. military for humanity and not for politics. And so this is an enormous shift in American thinking about the military, where the military is no longer thought of as a particularly political arm of the U.S. state, but as actually an arm of humanity itself, that you could recognize what's going wrong in the world and that you'll be able to use the military to stop it. And it's not a surprise, and this is what I think is really interesting, is that after the Cold War, really for the first time in American history, you have an explosion of public discussion about the Holocaust. So there's a little bit of discussion in the 60s and the 70s around the Eichmann trial in particular, and there's a famous basically soap opera about the Holocaust. But really, even if you Google Ngram something and you Google just the Holocaust, public discussions of the Holocaust really take off after the end of the Cold War, because essentially the Holocaust, I think at least, becomes the justification for American empire when the empire no longer faces a political or an existential threat. Because the Holocaust is I would say, wrongly remembered as the U.S. going abroad in order to save Europe's Jews. Now, of course, this ignores the fact that, for example, it was the Red Army that actually liberated Auschwitz and actually liberated the death camps in the East. But there's this idea that becomes very popular amongst liberal thinkers in the 1990s, and this idea is really underlined after the failure of the Clinton administration to intervene in the Rwandan genocide. And this is an enormous issue because right after the Rwandan genocide, there's a genocide in the Balkans against basically Bosnian Muslims. And so Clinton eventually intervenes in this genocide. He ends the siege of Sarajevo. And so you have these foundational paradigmatic experience to a generation of Generation Xers, literally, who see the American military basically, quote unquote, saving babies and saving innocents. And this is what really shapes public discussion for the next 20 years of thinking about the American military. So in the run-up to the invasion in Iraq, there's a lot of different arguments going around about why the United States needs to invade Iraq. But one of the most powerful was that there's a casus belli, there's a just war because Saddam has committed genocide against the Kurds, and that you could legitimately overthrow him because this is in the name of humanitarianism. So you have this conflation of the idea that the United States is able to act for humanity. And I'll end there, but I just want to underline one thing. I think it's also, the ironies of history is that actually a lot of the post-Soviet world was actually inviting the United States to do just this. Right. So this is where it gets complicated, because you actually have people on the ground in the former Soviet, less so maybe in Central Asia, but in the former, behind the Iron Curtain, saying, United States, come in, make Europe safe again. So there's this problem because in some sense, these people are listening to quote unquote people on the ground, even though they're basically maintaining the imperial military that was constructed during the Cold war. So the problem is that one of the many problems of humanitarian intervention is that to do it well, you need to have a essentially permanently mobilized military and a permanently mobilized society. And this is something people like Samantha Power never once considered.
Right. And so just to add to that, that's really interesting because on one hand, we know as an example, when it came to Iraq, which was obviously a significant dividing line in this, and I'm, these are very different figures, but I'm not a tanky. So I have appreciation for people in the, particularly independent trade unions in the 80s resisting oppression in the Soviet Union. And I actually think one of the most interesting things that Samuel Moyn documents in his book is that a lot of those people, some of them were reactionaries, some of them were neoliberals, but some of them were actually quite adamant the whole time that they were socialists, and they praised the Soviet system for achieving a degree of material security, and they just wanted to add political openness on top of that, which I think is actually, basically some version of that synthesis is what I think a lot of is our project. That's what we're struggling for. But anyways, that being as it may, Václav Havel, who, I think as part of his maybe some of the naivete that grew out of his struggle against, the Soviet system in the Czech Republic, which led him to sort of become a big fan of Clinton and Blair and a sort of endless romanticizer of America. He has this incredible mark against him because he went along with the invasion of Iraq. And then Nelson Mandela, who, we've talked a lot about on the show, certainly he and the ANC made peace with global capitalism, probably had no choice in liberation of apartheid, but he was unflinching in understanding what the war in Iraq was really all about in terms of imperial objectives. And that sort of split is really important. Do you think?
Well, and
please go ahead.
Just to very briefly, I think that's very important to emphasize because what winds up happening, unsurprisingly, perhaps I would say unsurprisingly, is that humanitarian intervention winds up occurring almost entirely in the global South. Or discussions about humanitarian intervention are almost entirely in the global South. And the International Criminal Court and all of these post-Cold War institutions that were created to quote-unquote manage the globe in a humanitarian way are basically ways to discipline the global South, which is why I think last time I checked, everyone who's ever been convicted by the ICC is from sub-Saharan Africa. Right. So I think it's not surprising that
maybe
Mandela
one from
would
the
be more aware.
Balkans, maybe one from the Balkans.
Well, there's Milosevic, but they had to create a separate court so the United States could actually participate in that because the U.S. doesn't belong to the ICC. Right. So there's also like these random courts created. But yeah, so it's most or maybe one or two, but it's clearly that. So then you get these divisions, right, between this quote unquote second world and what was then called the third world during the Cold War and the global South. So that's why someone like Havel would be in favor of Iraq, where someone like Mandela would not be, right? Their positions, their subjectivities are very different and really part of these very radically different histories. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's thank you. So, and then that actually, we're going to pivot in a second to Obama specifically, but I just want to say, so, and even when we look going back into something like Kosovo and the Balkans, which I want to re-educate myself on, but or something where there was a lot of discourse like on Darfur, it's not that, I don't buy a narrative that, oh no, Milosevic was just some misunderstood guy who was trying to, have national cohesion. Like there's no doubt that he was a butcher and he was a murderer. Absolutely. And he was playing, in fact, a lot of the kind of, I would say a lot of the politics that he favored are very trendy right now globally. But that the larger picture, though, is that also that even very much so in the Balkans, as well as all of these other places, that this conflate. I mean, first of all, obviously, during this whole time, you're ignoring and still supporting all sorts of governments and regimes that engage in equal atrocities. But if they're part of the Western system, they're not going to get bothered. Right. In fact, they'll get propped. So we're still, at the same time that Tony Blair is doing these highfalutin speeches about Kosovo, he's making sure that you can sell arms, arms to Suharto's Indonesia. And then so that this And the step I don't want to make here is to deny that these atrocities aren't taking place, which I think some people go to, which is a problem and unnecessary, whether we're talking about Syria or Kosovo. But at the same time, there's no doubt that what's really going on here is that there's a perceived threat to a NATO or Western security order. And that is real. Like, there's no military action that is purely going to take place, even from misguided humanitarian intentions, because that's simply not how it works.
Yeah, and I think what you're really highlighting is that I think in the 1990s and people who still sort of swim in this discourse, their fundamental problem is that they pose humanitarian intervention as a philosophical problem. Do we save innocent babies? Right. When that's actually not the question of humanitarian intervention. The question of humanitarian intervention is contextual, right? Those are the important questions. Do we know enough about what's going on the ground? How do we know that what we do isn't going to make things work like what happened, make things worse like what happened in Libya? Who are we actually interacting with? Is the United States going to commit itself to reconstruction efforts? And all of these different problems, right? So Power, in her books and in her writing, she always poses it as, do we save innocent babies? Like someone has a gun to a baby's head and right. We're there, and do we stop it? And yeah, of course, the answer to that is of course you save the innocent baby. But that's not actually the important questions of geopolitics. So they make a fundamental category error, which prevents them from providing good policy advice. And this is why you have someone like Power very much supporting intervention in Libya and very much supporting intervention in Syria, because she makes a fundamental category error. It's not really a moral question. It's a question of history, it's a question of process, and it's a question of context.
And in both of those conversations, like we just have this new report from Air Wars, saying that U.S. just airstrikes related to ISIS, regardless of even the broader questions of the proxy war with Assad, have killed at least 7,000 people in the last year. I mean, cumulatively, probably going back to 2014. I mean, it's tens of thousands of people. So that's the other part of the ledger, and the kind of stunning arrogance and naivete of this position is that you can, one, go into not ask the right basic framing questions and have this incredible imperial arrogance and sense of self-righteousness, but even the most basic question of, and this applied obviously to Kosovo and Serbia too. Okay, well, you're going to bomb Belgrade. Well, what are you doing when you bomb these places?
Right. What's the day after? Right. And this is the problem. They always talk about the moment of decision. It's actually, ironically, a very sort of right-wing way of viewing things, where the whole of politics boils down to making a decision. And this is, in fact, I would just want to emphasize for listeners, this is actually an element of American political culture where we understand the height of politics to be the moment of decision. So, for example, George W. Bush named his memoir Decision Points, and Hillary Clinton names her memoir Hard Choices. Right. So this is how we understand politics, about these moments of decision, when it's actually not really about that. It's about the incredibly large context, the multiple contexts, the multiple complexities that go into making a particular event. And so this is a real problem with policymaking generally in the United States.
You've just watched a Michael Brooks show video, and you can watch all of our full main live shows every Tuesday night at around 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and subscribe to get all of the clips you want. We're covering the globe. We're focusing on international relations, the intellectual dark web. We're having fun. We're doing deep dives with a lot of amazing guests. Of course, become a patron for the whole thing at patreon.com/TMBS, or subscribe to this YouTube channel and help us keep growing and get that content out there. Subscribe below.